Stand in the hallway of a British house built before 1930 in January, and you can feel it before you see it. Cold radiating off the wall, not from a draft but through the brick itself. No cavity to fill, no gap for insulation to sit in, just a single skin of brick between you and the outside, built that way on purpose, because in 1925, nobody building a house was thinking about heat loss at all. Britain has around 4.5 million homes like this, and 38% of all British housing was built before 1946, the highest share of pre-war housing anywhere in Europe. Government figures suggest fewer than 1 in 5 homes built before 1929 currently meets a basic modern efficiency standard. This is not a story about cold houses. It is a story about a country that kept building the regulations forward and never once turned around to fix what it had already built. A typical Victorian terrace built in the late 19th century was engineered for a world of cheap, abundant coal. Its walls consist of solid brick, 2 leaves laid tight against each other with no empty cavity between them and no space for any insulation material. Draughty timber sash windows and single-pane glazing allowed constant fresh air to circulate, feeding the open coal fires that served as the sole heat source for the entire household. At the time, local building bylaws governed fire safety, structural stability, and drainage, leaving thermal efficiency entirely unregulated. This physical fabric operated on a simple principle: heat was something to be continuously generated, not captured. As energy markets and expectations of comfort shifted, these solid-walled properties transformed from standard homes into permanent thermal liabilities. In 1965, England and Wales introduced their first nationwide building regulations, establishing the first statutory thermal limits for new residential housing. This legislation introduced the concept of the U-value, a measure of how readily heat passes through a building element, where a lower number indicates better resistance to heat loss. Under these new rules, external walls were permitted a maximum U-value of 1.7, while roofs and lofts were capped at 1.4. In practice, meeting the roof standard required just 2.8 centimeters of mineral wool, a depth that offered barely a token barrier against the cold. These performance limits applied only to homes built from 1965 onward. The regulations did not include any retroactive requirements, meaning not a single existing home was forced to upgrade. Millions of solid-walled Victorian and Edwardian properties remained entirely outside the scope of the law, creating a lasting division between modern construction standards and the millions of older homes where people actually lived. The 1973 oil crisis transformed domestic heat loss from a matter of personal comfort into a critical national economic issue. In response, the 1976 building regulations introduced Part F, establishing the first mandatory fuel conservation standards for new dwellings in England and Wales. These rules required builders to incorporate minimum insulation levels in walls and roofs to curb rising fuel bills. Yet once again, the law ignored the existing housing stock. Only houses built after 1976 had to comply, leaving millions of older, uninsulated homes untouched. Over the following decades, the government progressively tightened fabric requirements for new construction. In 1990, the maximum wall U-value dropped to 0.45 watts per square meter Kelvin. By 2002, it was lowered further to 0.35. While these updates introduced consequential improvements, meaning that if a homeowner built a major extension, that specific altered part had to meet the new standards, they never imposed a universal duty to upgrade a complete standing property. An untouched Edwardian terrace could remain exactly as draughty as the day it was built, legally compliant despite consuming immense amounts of energy. Each regulatory rewrite successfully improved the next generation of British houses, but they left the central policy question unanswered. Why was there still no equivalent standard to transform the millions of cold, inefficient homes already standing? In January 2013, the government launched the Green Deal to address the millions of existing homes left behind by building regulations. The scheme introduced a pay-as-you-save finance mechanism designed to fund insulation through a household's future electricity bills. Under its central guideline, known as the Golden Rule, the estimated yearly savings on energy bills had to equal or exceed the annual loan repayments. However, the financial structure carried interest rates of roughly 7 to 8% APR. Coupled with a complex assessment process, these costs deterred widespread participation. In its first 6 months, only 1,754 households signed up for the finance plans. The gap between initial interest, completed assessments, and actual retrofits proved too wide to bridge. Citing low take-up and concerns over commercial viability, the government withdrew public funding for the scheme in July 2015, ending the policy experiment just 2.5 years after its launch. In July 2020, the government launched its second major initiative, the Green Homes Grant, with a £1.5 billion budget. Designed to replace earlier repayment models, the scheme offered direct vouchers to homeowners and private landlords to cover up to 2/3 of insulation costs, targeting 600,000 homes. Administration was outsourced to ICF, an American consulting firm. Yet severe administrative bottlenecks quickly stalled the rollout. Long delays in issuing vouchers left installers unpaid and forced families to cancel orders. Under mounting industry pressure, the government scrapped the program in March 2021, less than a year after its announcement. By its closure, roughly 47,500 homes had actually been upgraded, less than 10% of the original target. The Commons Environmental Audit Committee later described the rollout as a well-intended but poorly executed failure, exposing the persistent gulf between an announced budget and a completed installation. Today, a home's efficiency is measured by its Energy Performance Certificate, or EPC, an overall rating from A to G based on modelled energy use, rather than direct wall measurements. Official data reveals that only 19% of British homes built before 1929 achieve a rating of C or above. While these remaining properties do not all share identical solid walls, the figure exposes a vast, cold heritage. Upgrading the nation's 29 million homes is estimated to require 20 years and £525 billion. For the millions who rent, progress is even slower. Private renters are 42% more likely than owner-occupiers to live in properties with uninsulated solid walls. This gap persists because of a split incentive. Landlords must pay for expensive insulation upgrades, while tenants receive the benefit of lower heating bills. The Passive House standard, developed in the early 1990s, limits a new home's heating demand to 15 kilowatt-hours per square metre per year. Meanwhile, a typical British home built before 1990 consumes between 150 and 200 kilowatt-hours. Upgrading these older structures requires a retrofit, improving a property after its original construction. Unlike modern cavity wall insulation, treating a solid brick wall is not a simple product swap. Adding insulation requires either wrapping the exterior in render, which alters the historic streetscape, or lining the interior rooms, which reduces living space and risks trapping destructive moisture within the masonry. Germany's approach offers a clear contrast in policy design, focusing on long-term institutional stability rather than rapid short-term fixes. In 1977, the nation introduced its first thermal insulation ordinance, establishing a regulatory baseline that was systematically tightened through the 1990s and 2000s under the ENEV Energy Saving Code. Rather than relying solely on mandates, Germany aligned its regulations with a reliable path for delivery. Since the early 2000s, the state-owned KfW Development Bank has provided continuous, subsidized retrofit loans and grants. This durable financial route allowed homeowners, builders, and supply chains to plan ahead with confidence, knowing the support would remain stable for decades. Germany has not upgraded every historic home or solved all its housing issues. Instead, this model highlights a structural comparison of policy mechanisms. While Germany maintained institutional continuity, Britain launched and then abruptly cancelled its equivalent retrofit schemes at least twice in the last 15 years, leaving the market fragmented and cautious. The decisive comparison lies in what happens to the millions of homes built before national regulations existed, rather than the ambition of future construction standards. Sustained progress requires three separate functioning mechanisms: clear regulation, accessible finance, and reliable delivery. The gap between a cold home and a warm one is rarely a technical puzzle. It is the distance between short-lived policy experiments and a permanent commitment to transform the past. Subscribe for more. If this story interested you, there is a video right here about what happened to the British High Street. Subscribe for more. Today, millions of British households remain trapped in an uninsulated architectural legacy. As energy costs rise, the divide between modern regulations and historic reality only deepens. Fixing this crisis requires more than legislating for future homes. It demands a sustained commitment to transforming the past.